Have you ever said yes to something and felt a quiet heaviness settle inside you almost immediately? A subtle tightening in your chest, a whisper that said, "I didn't really want that," and yet, the word had already left your mouth. Maybe it was a small thing. A favor you didn't have time for. A conversation you didn't have the energy to hold. Or a commitment that slowly began to feel like a burden. And still, you smiled, you agreed, you adjusted yourself to fit what was being asked of you. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that saying yes keeps things smooth. It keeps people happy. It keeps you accepted. But what if that quiet discomfort you feel is not weakness? What if it's truth? There is a moment, often so brief you barely notice it, where your inner voice speaks before you respond. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It simply pauses, hesitates, pulls back slightly. And in that moment, you already know your answer. But you override it. Not because you don't hear it, but because you've been taught not to trust it. You've been taught that being easygoing makes you good. That being available makes you valuable. That saying no makes you difficult, selfish, or unkind. And so, over time, you begin to measure yourself by how much you can give, how much you can tolerate, how little space you take up. And without realizing it, you slowly disappear from your own life. This is not something you decided consciously. It happened gradually, shaped by expectations, by subtle rewards, by the fear of disappointing others. You adapted. You became agreeable. You became reliable. But beneath that version of you, there is another presence. Quiet, steady, and often ignored. The part of you that knows when something is not right. The part of you that feels the weight of every unnecessary yes. The part of you that is waiting, not to rebel, not to withdraw, but simply to be heard. Because saying no is not about rejection. It is not about pushing people away or creating distance. It is about something much deeper, something more honest. It is about alignment. When you say yes to everything, you lose the ability to choose. And without choice, there is no ownership of your time, your energy, or your life. You begin to move according to what is asked of you, rather than what is true for you. And over time, that creates a quiet kind of exhaustion. Not just physical, but emotional. A sense that you are always giving, but rarely arriving. But there is another way to live. A way where your responses come from clarity, not pressure. Where your boundaries are not walls, but expressions of self-respect. Where your no is not harsh or defensive, but calm, grounded, certain. And the surprising truth is this: when you begin to say no in the right way, you don't lose connection. You deepen it. You don't become distant. You become real. This is a journey back to that quiet inner voice, the one that has always been there, waiting patiently beneath the noise of expectation. It is not about changing who you are, but remembering what you already know. And as you begin to listen more closely, you may start to notice something subtle shifting within you. A pause, a breath, a space where there used to be automatic agreement. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Chapter 1: The Conditioning of Yes. There is a moment, so small you might miss it, when someone asks something of you, and before your mind has fully formed a response, your body has already begun to lean forward. A slight nod. A soft yeah, almost automatic. And only afterward, sometimes seconds later, something quieter appears, a hesitation you didn't listen to, a feeling you didn't quite follow. This is not a mistake. It is a pattern. And that pattern has been forming for much longer than you might think. You were not born automatically agreeing with everything around you. You learned it slowly, subtly, through repetition. Through moments that didn't seem important at the time, but carried a quiet message about who you needed to be. Think back, not to specific memories, but to the atmosphere of earlier interactions, the way approval felt when it came your way. A smile, a softer tone, a sense of ease when you did what was expected. There was comfort in that. And when you moved against expectation, even in small ways, something shifted. Maybe it was tension. Maybe it was silence. Maybe it was just a feeling you couldn't name yet. But you felt it. And over time, without needing to analyze it, you began to understand something very simple. Agreement keeps things smooth. So you leaned into it. Not consciously, not as a strategy, but as a natural response to your environment. You adapted. You became aware of what made interactions easier, and you moved toward it again and again. Have you ever noticed how quickly you can sense what someone wants from you, even before they say it clearly? That sensitivity didn't appear by accident. It was shaped through countless small moments where you learned to read the room, to anticipate reactions, to adjust before anything became uncomfortable. And this ability, it has value. It helps you connect. It helps you navigate relationships. It allows you to move through the world with a certain ease. But there is a quiet cost to it, one that is easy to overlook. Because the more attention you give to what others expect, the less attention remains for what you feel. Not because your feelings disappear, but because they become secondary. Less urgent. Less practiced. So gradually, they become harder to hear. You begin to operate from what is visible, the request, the situation, the reaction in front of you, rather than the internal signal that arises within you. And this is where something subtle begins to shift. Your response becomes faster than your awareness. Someone asks, and before you've fully checked in with yourself, you've already answered. Yes. It feels natural. Efficient. Even kind. But there are moments, quiet ones, where something doesn't quite settle afterward. A thought appears. Did I actually want to do that? It doesn't always come with strong emotion. Sometimes it's just a faint sense of misalignment. A slight heaviness that lingers in the background as you move forward. And because it's not loud, you move past it. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. You adjust your expectations. You make it work. And most of the time, you do. But this is how the pattern continues. Not through major decisions, but through small, repeated moments where your internal response is bypassed in favor of what keeps things easy. And over time, that becomes your default. You become someone who says yes before fully knowing what that yes means. Not because you lack awareness, but because awareness hasn't been given enough space to fully form. There is always something slightly faster. A sense of urgency, even when none exists. A feeling that you need to respond quickly, to keep the flow going, to avoid creating a pause that might feel uncomfortable. So you move ahead. And that pause, the one where your real response lives, remains just out of reach. Have you ever tried to slow that moment down? To notice what happens between the request and your reply? At first, it can feel unfamiliar, even unnatural, because you are interrupting something that has been automatic for a long time. But if you stay there, even briefly, you may begin to notice something important. There is always an initial reaction. Not loud, not dramatic, but present. It might show up as a slight resistance, a sense of tightness, a quiet not really that doesn't use words, but is still clearly felt. And right after that, something else appears. A second layer. A voice that begins to explain, to adjust, to reinterpret. It says things like, "It's fine, it won't take long, you can handle it." And before you know it, that second layer replaces the first. Your response shifts. And you say yes. This sequence happens quickly. So quickly that it feels like one continuous thought. But it isn't. It is a pattern with layers. And once you begin to see those layers, you begin to understand something deeper about yourself. Your agreement is not always coming from willingness. Often, it is coming from habit. A habit shaped by repetition, reinforced by comfort, and maintained by the desire to keep things smooth. And again, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. It helped you belong. It helped you avoid unnecessary conflict. It gave you a way to move through situations with minimal friction. But what it did not give you is a consistent connection to your own boundaries. Because boundaries require something that this pattern does not allow. They require time. Time to feel. Time to notice. Time to choose. And when your responses are automatic, that time disappears. So your boundaries remain unclear, not because they don't exist, but because they haven't been given the space to emerge. It's like trying to hear a quiet sound in a room that is always filled with noise. The signal is there, but it's constantly being overridden. And the more this happens, the more your sense of self becomes shaped by what you do, rather than what you feel. You begin to define yourself by your reliability, your flexibility, your willingness to step in. These become your strengths. And they are strengths. But when they are not balanced with awareness, they begin to take over. You become the person who can always be counted on. The one who adjusts. The one who makes things work. And while that may feel good in many ways, it also creates a subtle pressure. An expectation, not just from others, but from yourself. You start to believe that this is who you are. And stepping outside of it, even slightly, feels uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. So the pattern continues. Not just because of external influence, but because it has become part of your identity. And this is where the real shift begins. Not in forcing yourself to say no, not in changing your behavior abruptly. But in recognizing that your automatic yes is not always a reflection of your true response. It is a reflection of what has been practiced. And anything practiced can be observed. Not judged. Not resisted. Just seen clearly. Because when you see a pattern without immediately reacting to it, something opens. A small space. And in that space, you are no longer moving on autopilot. You are aware. And awareness, even in its earliest form, begins to slow things down. The response is no longer immediate. The pause becomes slightly longer. And within that pause, something begins to return. A sense of choice. Not a dramatic one, not a complete shift overnight. But a subtle recognition that your response does not have to follow the same path every time. And that recognition is where everything begins to change. Because once you realize that your yes is not always fully yours, you begin to wonder what has been guiding it. What has been shaping it? What has been influencing it beneath the surface? And as that curiosity deepens, you may begin to notice that it is not just habit. There is something else there. Something quieter, but stronger. A feeling that seems to rise the moment you consider doing something different. A hesitation that is not about the task itself, but about what might happen if you don't agree. And as you start to look more closely at that feeling, you begin to see that behind the pattern of saying yes, there is something deeper waiting to be understood. Chapter 2: The Fear Behind No. There are moments when nothing seems urgent on the surface, a simple request, a small favor, a conversation that feels ordinary. And yet, somewhere inside you, something tightens almost instantly. It is not loud enough to stop you. Not strong enough to fully form into words. But it is there, a quiet resistance that appears before you even begin to respond. And then, almost just as quickly, it is replaced. Your mind moves ahead, scanning possibilities, imagining outcomes, adjusting your response before it even reaches the surface. You are no longer just considering the request, you are considering what might happen if you refuse it. Have you ever noticed how quickly your attention shifts like this? You begin with a feeling, and within seconds, you are inside a series of imagined reactions. A subtle tension in someone's voice. A pause that feels uncomfortable. A change in how you might be seen. And even if none of these things have actually happened, they feel real enough to influence you. So you respond. Not just to what is being asked, but to what you fear might follow if you don't agree. This is where the experience becomes deeper than habit. Because what you are responding to is not just the situation, it is the anticipation of loss. Loss of ease. Loss of connection. Loss of being seen in a certain way. And this anticipation is powerful. It does not need to be proven. It does not need evidence. It simply needs to feel possible. That is enough. So your response begins to shift, not based on what you want, but on what you are trying to avoid. And over time, this avoidance becomes almost invisible. It blends into your personality, into your way of interacting, into the rhythm of your decisions. You begin to believe that this is simply who you are, as someone who prefers harmony, someone who keeps things smooth. But beneath that, there is a constant calculation. A quiet effort to maintain stability by not disrupting anything. And this effort, it has a cost. Because every time you move in response to imagined discomfort, you move slightly away from what is real. Not dramatically, not in a way that is immediately noticeable, but enough that something inside you begins to feel less grounded. You may start to notice it in small ways. A sense of overthinking after conversations. Replaying what you said, wondering how it was received. Adjusting your words in hindsight, even when the moment has already passed. Or a subtle pressure before responding, as if your answer needs to be carefully shaped to avoid creating any friction. This is the presence of fear, and not as something overwhelming, but as something persistent. It does not stop you completely, but it guides you. It nudges you toward safety, toward predictability, toward what feels less risky. And in doing so, it slowly narrows your range of expression. Have you ever held back a simple truth, not because it was difficult to say, but because you weren't sure how it would be received? That hesitation is where fear becomes most visible. It is not about the size of the situation, it is about the uncertainty of the response. Because at its core, this fear is not just about conflict. It is about connection. The possibility, however small, that expressing your truth might create distance. And that possibility, even when it is unlikely, carries weight. So you adjust. You soften your words. You add explanations. You try to make your no sound more acceptable, more understandable, more gentle. Or sometimes, you avoid it entirely. You say yes, and then carry the weight of that decision quietly. Not because you don't care about others, but because you have learned to care about the reaction more than the reality. And this is where something important begins to shift in your awareness. You start to see that the discomfort you are avoiding is often not the situation itself, but the reaction to it. You are not afraid of saying no, you are afraid of what saying no might lead to. And this distinction changes everything. Because it shows you that your response is being shaped by something that has not even happened yet. A possibility. A projection. And when you begin to see that clearly, the intensity of that fear begins to soften. Not disappear, but loosen. You realize that many of the outcomes you anticipate are uncertain. They exist in your mind, not in the present moment. And yet, they have been guiding your decisions as if they were real. This is how fear operates. It fills in the gaps with imagined scenarios, and then asks you to respond to them as if they are already unfolding. And because your mind prefers certainty, it chooses the path that seems to minimize risk. Agreement. Compliance. Adaptation. But what if that sense of risk is not as solid as it feels? What if the discomfort you are trying to avoid is actually smaller, shorter, more manageable than your mind predicts? You may have experienced this before, a moment where you did say no, even slightly, and the outcome was not what you feared. Maybe there was a pause, maybe a brief shift in tone, but then it passed. And life continued. That experience matters. Because it shows you something your fear does not account for. That discomfort is often temporary. But when you avoid it completely, you replace it with something else. A longer, quieter discomfort that stays with you. A sense of misalignment that follows you into the rest of your day. A subtle weight that lingers beneath your actions. And this creates a choice, even if it is not immediately obvious. A choice between two kinds of discomfort. One that is brief and external. And one that is internal and enduring. And as you begin to see this more clearly, your relationship with fear begins to change. It is no longer something you need to eliminate. It becomes something you can observe. You notice how it arises. How quickly it fills your thoughts. How it tries to guide your response before you have fully considered your own position. And instead of following it immediately, you begin to pause. Not to resist it, but to understand it. You ask yourself, quietly, what am I actually afraid of here? Not in a dramatic way, but with curiosity. And sometimes, the answer is surprisingly simple. You are afraid of being misunderstood, or disappointing someone, or creating a moment of awkwardness that feels unfamiliar. And when you see it clearly, it becomes less overwhelming, because it is no longer vague. It is specific. And specific fears can be held differently. They can be questioned. Not aggressively, but gently. Is this outcome certain? Is it as significant as it feels? And most importantly, is avoiding it worth the cost of ignoring what I actually feel? These questions do not need immediate answers. But they begin to create space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are considering. And that consideration, even if it lasts only a few seconds, changes the entire experience. Because now, your response is not being driven entirely by fear. It is being shaped by awareness. And awareness brings a different kind of stability. Not the stability of keeping everything smooth, but the stability of being aligned with yourself. Even if that alignment creates a brief moment of discomfort. And as you begin to experience that, even in small ways, your confidence starts to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. You begin to trust that you can handle those moments. That you can sit with a pause, with a reaction, with a small change in the atmosphere, without needing to immediately fix it. And that trust is important. Because it allows you to remain present, even when things are not perfectly smooth. It allows you to choose your response, rather than default to what feels safest. And slowly, the role fear plays in your decisions begins to change. It is still there, but it is no longer in control. It becomes something you notice, something you take into account, but not something that determines your direction. And as that shift continues, another layer begins to come into view. Because even when fear starts to loosen its grip, there is still something else influencing your response. Something that feels less like anticipation and more like identity. A sense of who you believe you need to be in order to be accepted, valued, or seen in a certain way. And that belief often runs even deeper than fear. Chapter 3: The Myth of Being Good. Sometimes, the discomfort doesn't come from what you're about to say, but from what saying it might mean about you. You pause, not because you don't know your answer, but because you're unsure how that answer fits with the version of yourself you've been trying to be. There's a subtle hesitation, almost like you're checking something internally, not just the situation, but your identity within it. Am I being difficult? Am I being selfish? Even when the request is small, these questions can feel surprisingly heavy. And they don't come from the moment itself, they come from something older, something more deeply rooted in how you've learned to define what it means to be a good person. Because somewhere along the way, good became associated with ease. With being agreeable. With not creating tension. With being the person others don't have to worry about. And this definition feels safe. It gives you a clear way to move through interactions. A reliable way to be seen positively. If you're accommodating, flexible, understanding, then you're doing things right. At least, that's how it feels. But if you look more closely, you might begin to notice something subtle beneath that idea. This version of being good is not just about kindness, it's about control. Not control over others, but control over how you are perceived. You begin to shape your behavior, not only based on what feels right, but on what maintains that image. You become careful, measured, aware of how each response might affect how you are seen. And slowly, your actions start to serve that image. Have you ever found yourself agreeing to something, not because you truly wanted to, but because saying no felt like stepping outside of who you're supposed to be? That moment is important, because it reveals that your hesitation is not always about the situation, it's about identity. You are not just deciding what to do, you are deciding who you are allowed to be in that moment. And when being good is defined as being agreeable, saying no begins to feel like a contradiction, like a break in character. So even when you feel a clear internal response, you hesitate. You soften it. You reshape it. You try to express it in a way that still fits within that image. Or sometimes, you don't express it at all. You say yes. And from the outside, everything looks consistent. You remain kind, considerate, easy to be around. But inside, something becomes slightly strained. Because there is a difference between acting kindly and acting against yourself. And that difference, while quiet, is deeply felt. It shows up in small ways. A lack of enthusiasm. A sense of obligation rather than willingness. A subtle tension that lingers after the moment has passed. You may not name it directly, but it's there. And over time, this creates a kind of internal contradiction. You see yourself as a good person, but your experience doesn't always feel aligned with that. Because being good, as you've learned it, often requires you to ignore parts of yourself. And ignoring yourself, even for understandable reasons, has a cost. It creates distance. Not from others, but from your own clarity. You begin to second-guess your instincts. To question your reactions. To wonder whether what you feel is valid, or whether it needs to be adjusted before it can be expressed. And this questioning becomes constant. Not overwhelming, but persistent. A quiet layer of doubt that sits beneath your decisions. Have you ever noticed how quickly you try to justify your own needs? As if wanting something different requires explanation or permission. That impulse doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the belief that your natural response might not be acceptable on its own. That it needs to be softened, shaped, made more agreeable. And this is where the idea of being good begins to lose its clarity. Because what you are practicing is not just kindness, it is self-neglect in a subtle, socially acceptable form. It doesn't look harmful. It doesn't raise alarms. In fact, it is often rewarded. People appreciate your flexibility. They trust your reliability. They see you as someone who makes things easier. And in many ways, that feels good. But there is something important to recognize here. Approval is not the same as alignment. You can be appreciated by others and still feel disconnected from yourself. You can be seen as good and still feel something missing internally. Because goodness, in its truest form, is not about constant agreement. It is about honesty. Not harsh honesty, not reactive or rigid, but grounded, clear, and present. The kind of honesty that includes both you and the other person. But when your definition of being good excludes your own experience, it becomes incomplete. You are only showing one side. And the other side, the part that has limits, preferences, and boundaries, remains hidden. Not intentionally, but habitually. And the longer it stays hidden, the harder it becomes to access. You may begin to feel unsure of what you actually want. Not because you don't have preferences, but because they haven't been practiced openly. They've been filtered, adjusted, delayed. So when the moment comes to express them directly, it feels unfamiliar, uncertain, and sometimes even wrong. This is the quiet power of identity. It shapes not just what you do, but what feels acceptable to do. And when your identity is tied to being agreeable, anything outside of that feels like a risk. Not just socially, but internally. You feel a tension between staying true to yourself and staying consistent with who you believe you are. And that tension can be confusing, because both sides feel important. You want to be kind. You want to be considerate. But you also want to feel honest, clear, at ease with your own choices. And for a long time, it may seem like these two things are in conflict, that you must choose one over the other. But what begins to shift, slowly, is your understanding of what kindness actually means. Because kindness that excludes you is not complete. It may create comfort in the moment, but it does not create balance. And over time, that imbalance becomes harder to ignore. You may start to feel more drained, less present, less engaged. Not because you are doing too much, but because what you are doing is not fully aligned. And alignment matters. Not as an ideal, but as a lived experience. When your actions reflect what you truly feel, even in small ways, there is a sense of steadiness that comes with it. A quiet confidence. Not loud or assertive, but grounded. And that grounding begins to change how you see yourself. You are no longer just the person who keeps things smooth. You become someone who is real within the interaction. Someone who can hold both kindness and clarity at the same time. And this does not happen all at once. It begins in small moments. A slightly more honest response. A boundary expressed without over-explaining. A pause that you allow to exist without rushing to fill it. And in those moments, something shifts. You realize that being good does not mean being endlessly accommodating. It means being present. Present enough to recognize what is true for you, and to include that truth in how you respond. And when you do that, something interesting happens. The interaction may feel slightly different, less controlled, less predictable. But also more real. More balanced. Because now, you are not disappearing from the exchange. You are part of it. Fully. And as you begin to experience that, even in small ways, the old definition of being good starts to loosen. It no longer holds the same authority. It becomes something you can question. Something you can redefine. Not in opposition to others, but in inclusion of yourself. And that redefinition is where a deeper kind of freedom begins to take shape. Not loud. Not immediate. But steady. Because now, your actions are no longer guided solely by how they will be perceived, but by how they actually feel. And as that awareness continues to grow, you may begin to notice another subtle shift. Because even when you start to see through the old definition, there are still moments where saying yes feels easier. Not because you believe you should, but because you've done it for so long that it feels familiar. Comfortable, even when it's not fully aligned. And within that familiarity, there is another layer waiting to be understood. One that is less about identity and more about what happens when you continue to say yes, even when you don't mean it. Chapter 4: The Silent Build-up of Resentment. There are times when everything looks fine from the outside, you're showing up, responding, helping, agreeing, and yet something inside you feels slightly heavier than it should. Not enough to stop you. Not enough to make you react. Just enough to stay with you. It might show up later, when you're alone. A quiet replay of the moment. A thought that lingers longer than expected. A subtle sense that something about the interaction didn't sit right, even if you handled it well. And often, you move past it. You tell yourself it wasn't important. That it's normal. That this is just part of being considerate, part of being someone others can rely on. But these small moments, they don't disappear as easily as they seem. They accumulate. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but gradually, almost invisibly. A slight tension here. A moment of reluctance there. A quiet "I didn't really want to do that" that you don't fully acknowledge. And over time, these unspoken responses begin to form something beneath the surface. Something you may not immediately recognize. Resentment. Not the loud, explosive kind, but a quieter version. The kind that builds slowly, layer by layer, without ever announcing itself clearly. Have you ever noticed how irritation can appear in situations that don't seem to justify it? A small request that feels heavier than it should. A conversation that feels draining, even though nothing difficult was said. A moment where your patience feels thinner than usual, and you're not entirely sure why. That is often where this quiet accumulation begins to show itself. Because resentment doesn't usually come from one moment. It comes from many moments where something inside you was overlooked. Not by others, necessarily, but by you. Each time you say yes when you mean no, something is set aside. Not forcefully, but gently. And because it is gentle, it is easy to ignore. But what is set aside does not disappear. It stays. And when it stays long enough, it begins to change how you experience things. You may start to feel less open, less willing, less present. Not because the situation has changed, but because your internal state has. And this is where the pattern becomes more complex. Because from the outside, it may look like the problem is with the people around you. It may feel like they are asking too much, expecting too much, not noticing your effort. And sometimes, that may be true. But often, there is another layer. One that is easy to miss. You have been saying yes, in ways that were not fully aligned with you. And now, that misalignment is beginning to surface, not as clarity, but as tension. Have you ever felt frustrated with someone, and then realized, quietly, that you had never actually expressed your limits to them? That they didn't know what you were comfortable with, because you had never shown them? That realization can feel uncomfortable. Because it shifts the perspective. It's no longer just about what others are doing, it's about what has been left unspoken. And this is not about blame. It's about awareness. Because when your boundaries are not expressed, they cannot be recognized. And when they are not recognized, they are often crossed, unintentionally. So the cycle continues. You say yes. You adjust. You manage. And internally, something builds. Not loudly, but steadily. Until it begins to affect how you feel, even in moments that should feel neutral. You might notice a sense of withdrawal. A reduced desire to engage. A quiet resistance that shows up, not because of the current situation, but because of everything that has come before it. And this is where resentment becomes confusing. Because it doesn't always match the moment. It feels disproportionate, slightly misplaced. And that makes it harder to understand. You may wonder, why does this bother me so much? Why does something so small feel so heavy? But the weight is not coming from the present. It is coming from accumulation. From all the times you moved past your own response, without fully acknowledging it. And over time, this begins to create distance. Not just from others, but from yourself. Because resentment carries a quiet message. Something inside you is not being honored. Not fully. And until that changes, the feeling continues to return. In different forms. At different moments. Sometimes as irritation. Sometimes as fatigue. Sometimes as a subtle desire to withdraw completely, to create space, even if you're not sure why you need it. Have you ever felt like you needed a break, not from something specific, but from everything? That sense of needing distance often comes from this quiet build-up. From carrying more than you realize. From responding in ways that don't fully reflect what you feel again and again. And eventually, your system begins to push back. Not aggressively, but persistently. It asks for space. For relief. For something to change. And this is where a deeper understanding begins to form. Resentment is not the problem. It is a signal. Not something to suppress, but something to listen to. Because it is pointing toward something that has been missing. Clarity. Expression. Alignment. It is showing you where your responses have not matched your truth. And while that can feel uncomfortable, it is also useful. Because it gives you information. It shows you where attention is needed. Not in a harsh way, not as criticism, but as awareness. You begin to see that the moments you dismissed were not as small as they seemed. They mattered. Because they were moments where you had a response and didn't fully follow it. And as you recognize that, something begins to shift. You don't need to go back and fix everything. You don't need to confront every situation or explain every past decision. But you can begin to notice what is happening now. In real time. You can start to see the early signs. The slight hesitation. The quiet resistance. The feeling that something doesn't fully align. And instead of moving past it immediately, you can pause. Just enough to acknowledge it. Not to act on it right away, but to recognize it. Because recognition changes the dynamic. It prevents accumulation. It allows your experience to be seen before it turns into something heavier. And in that simple shift, something begins to ease. The tension does not build in the same way. The need for withdrawal becomes less intense. because you are no longer carrying everything silently. You are allowing your internal responses to exist without immediately overriding them. And that alone begins to create a different kind of relationship with yourself. One where your experience matters. Not as an obstacle, but as guidance. And as that relationship strengthens, the way you respond to others begins to change as well. Not dramatically, not all at once. But in small, noticeable ways. A bit more clarity. A bit more honesty. A bit less automatic agreement. And over time, that reduces the need for resentment to build at all. Because what was once unspoken begins to be included. Gently. Naturally. Without force. And as you continue to observe this, another layer starts to reveal itself. Because recognizing what you feel is one step. But expressing it is something else entirely. Chapter 5, Awareness, Hearing Your Inner No. A simple request comes in, and before you've had time to think it through, your body gives you a quiet answer. It's not spoken. It doesn't argue or explain. It just shifts. Your energy dips slightly, or your attention pulls back, almost as if something inside you is stepping away from the moment. It's subtle enough to overlook, especially when everything around you continues moving forward. And most of the time, you move with it. You respond, you adapt, you continue the conversation as if nothing happened. But something did happen. You felt something real, before your thoughts had the chance to shape it. And this is where your awareness begins to deepen. Because what you felt in that brief moment wasn't confusion, it wasn't indecision. It was clarity, in its earliest form. Not the kind that arrives as a full sentence, but the kind that shows up as a signal. A direction. A quiet indication of alignment, or misalignment. And for a long time, this signal may have been present without your attention. It appeared, and disappeared, without leaving much trace. But now, you're starting to notice it. And noticing it changes everything. Because once you become aware of that initial response, you begin to see how often it gets replaced. Almost immediately, your mind steps in. It starts to interpret, to evaluate, to adjust. It considers the situation, the other person, the context, the consequences. And in doing so, it transforms your response. What began as a simple internal reaction becomes something more refined, more acceptable, more aligned with what feels appropriate rather than what feels true. And this transformation happens quickly. So quickly that it feels like one continuous process. But it's not. There are two distinct moments. The first is your immediate, unfiltered response. The second is your interpretation of that response. And learning to recognize the difference between these two is the core of awareness. Have you ever agreed to something, and then felt a quiet resistance afterward, as if part of you was still holding on to a different answer? That resistance didn't appear later. It was there from the beginning. You just didn't stay with it long enough to hear it clearly. And now, that's what you're beginning to do. Not by forcing yourself to react differently, but by allowing that first response to exist for a moment longer. By not rushing to replace it. By simply noticing it, without judgment. And that simple act of noticing begins to reveal patterns. You start to see that your inner responses are consistent. Certain situations bring the same kind of hesitation. Certain people or dynamics create the same subtle tension. Certain requests feel heavier, even before you've considered them fully. And these patterns are not random. They are reflections of your boundaries, your energy, your capacity. Things that exist within you, whether you acknowledge them or not. Your inner know is simply the earliest expression of those things. Not a decision, but a signal. And when you begin to recognize it as such, your relationship with it starts to change. It's no longer something to dismiss or override. It becomes something to listen to. Not blindly, not impulsively, but with curiosity. What is this response pointing to? What is it telling me about how I feel right now? These questions are not meant to create pressure. They are meant to create space. Because awareness is not about immediately acting on every signal. It's about understanding what the signal means. And understanding takes time. At first, you may only recognize your inner know after the moment has passed. You say yes, and then, moments later, something feels slightly off. A quiet misalignment. And instead of dismissing it, you begin to acknowledge it. You see it for what it is, a response that you didn't fully hear in time. And even that recognition matters. Because it begins to bring your attention to the process. Then, gradually, something shifts. You begin to notice earlier. In the moment itself. A request is made, and before your answer forms, you feel that familiar pause. This time, you stay with it. Not for long, just long enough to recognize it. And in that recognition, something becomes clearer. Not necessarily what you will say, but what you are experiencing. And that clarity, even in its simplest form, changes the quality of your response. Because now, your answer is not coming from habit alone. It is coming from awareness. And awareness brings a different kind of presence. You are no longer reacting automatically. You are responding. Even if the response is still evolving. But this process is not always comfortable. Because as your awareness grows, so does your sensitivity to misalignment. You begin to feel more clearly when something doesn't sit right. And that can create tension. Moments where your internal response and your external habit don't match. Where you feel a clear no, but still find yourself leaning toward yes. And in those moments, there is a gap. A space between what you feel and what you do. And that space can feel uncertain. Not because something is wrong, but because something is changing. You are no longer moving entirely on autopilot. You are seeing the process as it unfolds. And that visibility brings both clarity and responsibility. You begin to realize that your responses are not fixed. They are shaped. And now, you are part of that shaping. Not in a forceful way, but in an aware way. And that awareness begins to slow things down. You pause more often. You take a breath before responding. You allow yourself to feel what is present, even if it's not fully clear. And in that pause, something new becomes possible. Choice. Not the kind of choice that feels like pressure, but the kind that feels like openness. You are no longer limited to one automatic response. You can consider. You can reflect. You can decide. And even if you still choose the same response, it feels different. Because now, it includes your awareness. It reflects your understanding of the moment. And over time, this begins to shift your sense of trust. You start to trust that what you feel has value. That your internal responses are not random or unreliable. That they are meaningful, even when they are subtle. And this trust is important. Because without it, awareness remains passive. You see what is happening, but you don't fully engage with it. With trust, awareness becomes active. It informs your decisions. It shapes your responses. It becomes part of how you move through the world. And this shift does not require perfection. You will still have moments where you move quickly, where you follow old patterns, where your awareness arrives just a little too late. And that's okay. Because the goal is not to eliminate those moments. It's to recognize them. To learn from them. To allow each experience to bring you closer to your own clarity. And as this process continues, something begins to settle within you. A quieter relationship with yourself. Less conflict. Less confusion. More alignment. Not because everything is easy, but because you are no longer ignoring what is present. You are including it. And that inclusion changes how everything feels. Your responses become less forced. Less reactive. More grounded. More real. Because they are connected to something deeper than habit. They are connected to you. And as that connection strengthens, another question begins to take shape. Not about whether you can hear your inner no, but about what it means to follow it when it truly matters. Chapter 6: The Power of the Pause. You're about to answer, and for once, you don't. The words are there, ready, familiar, almost automatic, but something in you holds them back. Not forcefully, not as resistance, just a quiet delay, as if your response is waiting for permission that hasn't been given yet. A few seconds pass. Nothing collapses. Nothing breaks. The moment simply stretches, and within that stretch, something changes. This is the pause. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It's easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. Just a brief silence, a slight delay, a small gap between what is asked and what is said. But within that gap, there is space. And that space is where everything begins to shift. For a long time, your responses may have followed each other without interruption. A question comes in, an answer comes out. Smooth, efficient, immediate. There is a certain comfort in that rhythm. It keeps things moving. It keeps interactions easy. It prevents awkwardness, avoids uncertainty, maintains flow. But it also removes something essential. Time. Not a large amount, just enough to feel what is actually happening inside you before you respond. Without that time, your awareness doesn't have room to fully emerge. Your inner response appears and disappears before it can be recognized. And so, your answer is shaped by habit, by expectation, by what feels easiest in the moment, rather than by what is actually true for you. The pause interrupts that pattern. It doesn't force a different answer. It simply creates the possibility of one. Have you ever taken a moment before replying and felt your response begin to shift, even slightly? Not because you were trying to change it, but because you were giving yourself the chance to feel it more clearly. That shift comes from space. From allowing the moment to exist without immediately filling it. And at first, this can feel unfamiliar. Even uncomfortable. Silence, especially in conversation, can feel like something that needs to be resolved quickly. A gap that needs to be closed. A moment that requires action. So your instinct may be to move past it. To respond quickly, to keep things flowing, to avoid creating any sense of hesitation. But what if that hesitation is not a problem, but a doorway? A doorway into awareness. Because when you pause, even briefly, you begin to notice more. Not just the words being spoken, but the reactions within you. You feel the difference between a response that is immediate and one that is emerging. You sense when something aligns and when it doesn't. And this sensing does not require effort. It only requires time. A few seconds of not responding. A few seconds of being present. And within those seconds, something subtle begins to unfold. Your thoughts slow down. Your attention shifts inward. You become aware of what is actually happening, rather than just reacting to what is in front of you. And from that awareness, your response changes. Not dramatically. Not always in what you say, but in how you say it. There is more clarity. More steadiness. Less urgency. Because now, your response is not trying to keep up with the moment. It is arising from within it. But the pause is not just about clarity. It is also about choice. Because without a pause, your responses are continuous. One leads to the next, without interruption. And in that continuity, there is little room to choose. You are simply following a pattern. But when you introduce a pause, even a brief one, you create a break in that pattern. And in that break, something new becomes possible. You are no longer limited to your usual response. You can consider alternatives. You can feel your way into the moment rather than thinking your way through it. You can choose. And choice does not mean complexity. It does not mean overthinking or analyzing every situation. It simply means that your response is not automatic. It includes awareness. And awareness brings a different kind of presence. You are not just participating in the interaction, you are experiencing it. Fully. With yourself included. Have you ever noticed how different a conversation feels when you are not rushing to respond? When you allow yourself to listen, not just to the other person, but to your own reaction as well. There is a shift. The interaction becomes less mechanical, less predictable. More real. Because you are no longer just playing a role. You are present within it. And this presence changes the dynamic. Not always visibly, but internally. You feel more grounded. More connected. Less pulled by the need to respond quickly, more guided by what actually feels true. But the pause also reveals something else. It shows you how strong the impulse to respond immediately can be. How quickly your mind wants to fill the space. To resolve the moment, to avoid uncertainty, to move forward. And this impulse is not wrong. It has been useful. It has helped you navigate situations smoothly, avoid discomfort, maintain connection. But it is also part of the pattern you are beginning to shift. Because when every moment is filled instantly, there is no room for awareness to grow. So the pause becomes a practice. Not something you force, but something you allow. A willingness to let the moment breathe before you step into it. And this practice does not need to be perfect. You don't need to pause in every interaction. You don't need to create long silences or dramatic delays. Sometimes, it's just a breath. A brief moment of stillness before your response continues. And even that is enough. Because it interrupts the automatic flow. It creates a small opening where awareness can enter. And over time, these small openings begin to change how you experience your responses. You start to feel them more clearly. To recognize when something is aligned and when it isn't. To sense when your answer is coming from habit and when it is coming from clarity. And this sensing becomes more natural. Less forced. More integrated. You are not trying to pause, you are simply allowing yourself to respond at your own pace. And that pace is important. Because when you move too quickly, you move past yourself. You respond before you have fully arrived in the moment. But when you allow even a brief pause, you give yourself the chance to arrive. To be present, not just externally, but internally as well. And from that place, your responses begin to feel different. More intentional. More grounded. Less influenced by pressure, more guided by awareness. But this shift is not always easy. Because pausing can feel like stepping into uncertainty. You are no longer relying on immediate responses. You are allowing something to emerge. And emergence takes trust. Trust that your response will come. Trust that you don't need to have the answer immediately. Trust that the moment can hold a few seconds of silence without falling apart. And this trust grows gradually. Through experience. Through moments where you pause and realize that nothing breaks. That the conversation continues. That the connection remains. And that you feel more aligned within it. And as this trust deepens, the pause becomes less of a technique and more of a natural part of how you engage. You no longer rush to respond. You allow your response to form. And in that allowance, something shifts. You are no longer reacting to the moment. You are participating in it. With awareness. With presence. With choice. And this changes more than just your words. It changes your relationship with yourself. Because now, your internal experience is not being skipped. It is being included. You are listening before speaking. Feeling before deciding. And this sequence, this simple shift, creates a different kind of alignment. One where your responses are not separate from what you feel, but connected to it. And that connection, even in its simplest form, is powerful. Because it brings you back to yourself. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. But steadily. Moment by moment. Pause by pause. And as you continue to allow that space, something else begins to become clear. Because once you can pause, once you can feel, once you can recognize what is true for you, the next step is no longer about hearing it. It's about expressing it. Chapter 7, Saying No Without Guilt. You feel it most clearly in the moment after you've decided, when the words are about to leave your mouth, and something inside you tightens, not because you're unsure, but because you know. You know what you want to say. And yet, something else rises with it. A subtle weight, almost immediate, not coming from the situation itself, but from within you. A feeling that doesn't question your decision, but questions how it will be received and what it might mean about you. This is where guilt begins to appear. Not as something loud or overwhelming, but as a quiet undercurrent that accompanies your honesty. It doesn't stop you directly, it simply makes the moment heavier than it needs to be. And because of that, you hesitate. Not because your answer is unclear, but because expressing it feels like it carries a cost. Have you ever noticed how quickly your mind tries to soften a no? How it reaches for explanations, justifications, gentle wording, anything that might reduce the impact, make it easier to accept, less disruptive. You might say no, but then immediately follow it with reasons. Or apologies. Or alternatives. As if the no itself is not enough. As if it needs to be supported, or even corrected. And this instinct comes from somewhere deeper than the moment itself. It comes from the belief that your honesty might cause harm. That by saying no, you are taking something away. Creating disappointment. Breaking an expectation. And because you care about how others feel, you try to balance that. You try to express your truth in a way that minimizes any possible discomfort. But in doing so, something subtle happens. Your no begins to lose its clarity. Not because your intention is unclear, but because your delivery becomes shaped by the need to avoid guilt. And over time, this creates a pattern. Where even when you say no, you don't fully feel free. There is still a sense of responsibility for how it lands. A quiet pressure to manage the reaction, to ensure that everything remains smooth. And this is where the deeper insight begins to unfold. Guilt, in this context, is not always a signal that something is wrong. It is often a reflection of a belief you've been carrying. A belief that says your boundaries should not inconvenience others. That your limits should be flexible. That your needs should adapt, rather than interrupt. And when you begin to move outside of that belief, even slightly, guilt appears. Not as a consequence, but as a reaction to change. Have you ever felt guilty for doing something that was actually right for you? Not because it caused real harm, but simply because it didn't align with what others expected? That feeling is important. Because it shows you that guilt is not always tied to your actions. It is often tied to your conditioning. To what you've learned about what is acceptable, what is kind, what is expected of you. And when you begin to act outside of that, your system responds. Not to stop you, but to question you. To pull you back toward what is familiar. And this is where many people turn away. Not because they don't know what they want to say, but because they don't want to feel that discomfort. So they adjust. They soften. They explain. Or they avoid saying no altogether. But what you are beginning to see now is that the discomfort itself is not the problem. It is part of the process. It is what happens when you start to realign your actions with your internal truth. And that realignment does not always feel easy. At least, not at first. Because you are stepping outside of a pattern that has been reinforced over time. A pattern where your value may have been connected to how much you could accommodate, how little friction you created, how smoothly you fit into expectations. And now, you are shifting that. You are allowing your responses to reflect what you feel, even when it creates a moment of uncertainty. And that shift brings with it a new experience. One where your no is not followed by immediate ease, but by a brief sense of tension. A pause. A reaction, real or imagined. And within that, guilt can arise. But instead of seeing it as something to avoid, you begin to understand it differently. You see it as a signal that you are doing something new. Something unfamiliar. Not something wrong. And this changes how you relate to it. You no longer need to eliminate guilt in order to act. You allow it to be present without letting it determine your response. Have you ever stayed with that feeling instead of immediately trying to resolve it? Just noticing it without adjusting your words, without correcting your response, without rushing to make everything comfortable again. At first, it may feel uneasy. Because you are not doing what you're used to doing. You are not managing the moment. You are letting it unfold. And in that unfolding, something begins to settle. The initial tension softens. The reaction, if there is one, passes. And you remain. Not disconnected. Not rejected. Just present. And this is where a deeper kind of confidence begins to form. Not the kind that comes from controlling outcomes, but the kind that comes from staying aligned with yourself. Even when it feels uncertain. Even when it feels slightly uncomfortable. Because you begin to see that your no does not create as much disruption as you imagined. That most moments pass. That people adjust. That connection, when it is genuine, does not depend on constant agreement. And this realization begins to loosen something inside you. The belief that your honesty is a threat. The idea that saying no will always lead to something negative. Instead, you start to see it as part of a balanced interaction, where both you and the other person are allowed to exist fully. Not just one adapting to the other. And from this perspective, your no becomes simpler. Less burdened. Less shaped by the need to protect everything around it. It becomes a clear expression of your current state. Not a rejection, not a judgment, just a response. And that simplicity changes how it feels. You no longer need to over-explain. You no longer need to justify every decision. You begin to trust that your response is enough, even when it is brief. Even when it is not accompanied by a detailed explanation. And this trust grows gradually. Through experience. Through moments where you say no, and allow the response to stand on its own. Through moments where you feel the discomfort, and remain present within it. And each time, something shifts. The guilt becomes less intense. Less immediate. Less convincing. Because you are no longer responding to it automatically. You are observing it. And in that observation, you begin to separate yourself from it. You see that the feeling is there, but it is not directing you. It is simply part of the experience. And this creates a different kind of freedom. Not freedom from discomfort, but freedom within it. The ability to act in alignment with yourself, even when not everything feels perfectly smooth. And that is a different kind of strength. Quiet. Steady. Grounded. Because it is not dependent on external approval. It is rooted in your connection to your own experience. And as that connection deepens, something else begins to change. Your relationship with responsibility. You begin to see that you are responsible for your actions, your choices, your honesty. But not for how others interpret them. Not for every reaction, every feeling, every outcome. And that distinction is important. Because it allows you to express yourself without carrying the weight of everything that follows. You are present. You are respectful. You are clear. And that is enough. And from that place, your no becomes something different. Not something you defend. Not something you soften unnecessarily. But something you express with calm, with clarity, with trust. And as you continue to experience that, you may begin to notice a quiet shift in how you see yourself. Because you are no longer just the person who adapts, who accommodates, who keeps everything smooth. You are someone who can remain present, even when things are not perfectly comfortable. Someone who can hold both honesty and connection at the same time. And that realization opens the door to something deeper. Not just in how you respond, but in who you are becoming as you do. Chapter 8: The Identity Shift from Pleaser to Chooser. At some point, something subtle begins to change, not just in what you say, but in how you see yourself while saying it. The words may sound similar on the surface. You might still respond calmly, still consider others, still remain thoughtful in how you engage. But internally, the experience is no longer the same. There is less pressure to adjust. Less urgency to maintain an image. More space to be real. And in that space, a quiet realization begins to take shape. You are no longer responding only to what is being asked of you, you are responding from a place within you. And that difference, while small at first, begins to reshape everything. Because for a long time, your responses may have been guided by something that felt natural, almost automatic. A tendency to adapt. To anticipate. To smooth things out before they became uncomfortable. It didn't feel like a role you were playing. It felt like who you were. Someone who understands, someone who accommodates, someone who makes things easier for others. And there is value in that. There is care in that. But what you are beginning to see now is that this way of responding was not always a choice. It was a pattern. A learned way of navigating connection, shaped by experience, reinforced over time. And when something is repeated often enough, it starts to feel like identity. You begin to think, this is just how I am. Have you ever described yourself in ways that reflect this pattern? Saying things like, I'm just someone who doesn't like to say no, or I don't want to disappoint people, or I'd rather adjust than create tension. These statements feel true. But they are not fixed. They are reflections of patterns that have been practiced. And what you are beginning to do now is step outside of that pattern, even if only slightly. You are noticing moments where your response does not follow the usual path. Where instead of immediately adapting, you pause. You feel. You consider. And sometimes you choose differently. And in those moments, something shifts. Not just in the interaction, but in how you experience yourself. Because now, your response is not automatic. It is chosen. And that distinction is important. Because identity is not just built from what you do, but from how you experience what you do. When your actions are automatic, your identity feels fixed. But when your actions are chosen, your identity becomes flexible. You begin to see that you are not limited to one way of being. You can adapt and still have limits. You can care and still be clear. You can be kind and still say no. And this begins to dissolve the old assumption that these qualities are in conflict. That being considerate requires you to ignore yourself. That being good means being agreeable. Instead, you start to see that these things can coexist. That you can remain connected without losing your sense of self. And this is where the shift becomes deeper. Because you are no longer just changing your behavior. You are changing your relationship with who you believe you are. You move from being someone who reacts to someone who chooses. From someone who adapts automatically to someone who responds intentionally. And this shift is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, in small moments where you notice that your response is coming from a different place. A place that includes you. Not just the situation, not just the other person, but you as well. Have you ever experienced a moment where you said no, and instead of feeling tension afterward, you felt a sense of steadiness? Not relief exactly, but a quiet alignment. A sense that what you said matched what you felt. That feeling is new, not because it never existed, but because it was often overlooked. And as you begin to recognize it, it becomes more familiar. More accessible. You start to trust that alignment more than the need to maintain constant ease. And with that trust, your decisions begin to change. Not dramatically, not all at once. But gradually. You pause more. You listen more. You respond with greater clarity. And over time, these small shifts begin to form a new pattern. One where your actions are not driven by pressure, but by awareness. And as this pattern strengthens, your identity begins to shift with it. You no longer see yourself only as someone who keeps things smooth. You begin to see yourself as someone who can hold both clarity and connection. Someone who can remain present, even when the moment is not perfectly comfortable. And that presence becomes your new reference point. Not how things appear externally, but how they feel internally. You begin to ask different questions. Not, how will this be received? But, does this feel true for me? And this question changes the direction of your attention. It brings you back to yourself. Not in a way that isolates you, but in a way that includes you in the interaction. Fully. And this inclusion creates a different kind of balance. You are no longer moving only in response to others. You are moving in relation to yourself as well. And that balance, while subtle, is powerful. Because it removes the sense of imbalance that was always present when you were only adapting. Now there is reciprocity. A mutual presence. Where both sides exist, not one adjusting entirely to the other. And this changes how you experience connection. It becomes less about maintaining harmony at all costs, and more about being real within the interaction. And real does not mean harsh. It does not mean rigid or distant. It means honest, present, clear. And when you show up in that way, something else begins to happen. You start to feel less pressure to manage every moment. Less responsibility for how everything unfolds. Because you are no longer trying to control the outcome. You are simply expressing what is true and allowing the rest to follow. And this creates a sense of ease that is different from the ease you may have been used to. It is not the ease of avoiding tension. It is the ease of being aligned. And that kind of ease is more stable, more sustainable, because it does not require constant adjustment. It comes from within. And as you continue to experience this, your sense of self becomes clearer. Less defined by patterns, more defined by awareness. Less shaped by expectation, more shaped by choice. You begin to recognize that you are not the habits you've practiced. You are the one who can observe them and choose differently. And that recognition is freeing. Not because it removes all difficulty, but because it gives you flexibility. You are no longer locked into one way of responding. You can adapt without losing yourself. You can care without overextending. You can say yes and mean it. You can say no and trust it. And in that flexibility, your identity becomes more grounded. Not fixed, but stable. Not rigid, but clear. And this clarity begins to influence everything. How you engage. How you decide. How you relate to others and to yourself. Because now, you are not just reacting to what happens. You are participating in how it unfolds. With awareness. With presence. With choice. And as this continues, something else begins to settle. A quiet confidence. Not loud, not performative, but steady. Because it is not based on external approval. It is based on your ability to remain connected to yourself, regardless of the situation. And that confidence changes how you move through the world. You are no longer trying to fit into every moment. You are allowing each moment to meet you as you are. And that shift, while subtle, opens the door to something deeper. Because once you begin to live from this place, the question is no longer about whether you can say no. It becomes something else entirely. How you want to shape the life that those choices begin to create. Chapter 9: Protecting Your Energy and Time. The day moves forward, filled with small decisions that seem almost insignificant on their own. A message you respond to without thinking. A request you agree to out of habit. A task you take on, even though your energy was already stretched thin. Nothing feels overwhelming in the moment. Each choice appears manageable, reasonable, even necessary. And yet, by the end of the day, something feels different. Not dramatic, just a quiet sense of depletion. As if your time has been used, but not entirely chosen. And when you sit with that feeling, even briefly, a realization begins to surface. It's not always the big decisions that shape your life. It's the accumulation of the small ones. The moments where you say yes without fully checking in. The instances where your attention shifts away from yourself, just long enough to follow a familiar pattern. And over time, these moments begin to define how your energy is spent. Because your energy is not just physical. It's emotional, mental, relational. It moves with your attention, your engagement, your presence. And every time you say yes, you are directing that energy somewhere. Not just externally, but internally as well. You are committing a part of yourself. And when that commitment is aligned, it feels natural, even fulfilling. But when it isn't, something subtle begins to build. A quiet tension. Not always noticeable right away, but present. Have you ever reached the end of a day and wondered where your time actually went? Not in a logistical sense, but in a felt sense? As if you were present for everything, and yet, somehow, not fully present for yourself? That feeling doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from doing things that were not fully chosen. And this is where your awareness begins to deepen once again. Because now, the focus is not just on what you say, but on what you give. Your time. Your energy. Your attention. These are not unlimited. Even if they sometimes feel like they should be. There is a natural limit to how much you can engage, how much you can hold, how much you can offer without losing your sense of balance. And when you move beyond that limit repeatedly, it doesn't show up immediately. It shows up gradually. In the way your focus starts to drift. In the way your patience shortens. In the way your responses become less present, more automatic. Not because you don't care, but because you are stretched. And often, this stretching happens quietly. Not through one big decision, but through many small ones. Moments where you felt a slight hesitation, but moved past it. Moments where your inner response was unclear, but you agreed anyway. Moments where it felt easier to say yes, than to pause and consider. And none of these moments feel significant on their own. But together, they shape how your energy is distributed. And eventually, how you feel within your own life. So something begins to shift. You start to see your time and energy differently. Not as something to be filled, but as something to be directed. Not as something that is simply used, but as something that reflects your choices. And this changes how you approach even the smallest decisions. You begin to ask yourself, not just can I do this, but do I want to give my energy to this? Not in a harsh or restrictive way, but in a clear and honest way. Because the question is not about capability. It's about alignment. And this distinction is important. You may be capable of doing many things. Of helping, supporting, responding, accommodating. But capability does not automatically mean willingness. And willingness is where your energy becomes intentional. Have you ever agreed to something simply because you could, even though you didn't fully want to? And afterward, felt a quiet resistance as you followed through? That resistance is not laziness. It is misalignment. A signal that your action and your internal state are not fully connected. And the more often this happens, the more your energy begins to feel fragmented. Spread across places that do not fully resonate. And this is where protecting your energy begins. Not as a rigid boundary, but as a form of awareness. A recognition that what you give your time to shapes your experience of life. And that recognition invites a different kind of attention. You begin to notice where your energy flows easily and where it feels strained. Where your engagement feels natural and where it feels forced. And these observations are not meant to limit you. They are meant to guide you. Because when your actions are aligned with your energy, there is a sense of ease. Not because everything is effortless, but because your effort feels chosen. And when your actions are not aligned, even simple tasks can feel heavy. Not because they are difficult, but because they are not fully yours. And as you become more aware of this, your decisions begin to shift. You pause more often. Not just before responding, but before committing. You allow yourself to feel the weight of what is being asked. Not just in terms of time, but in terms of energy. And that feeling gives you information. Sometimes, the answer becomes clear. Other times, it remains uncertain. But even in uncertainty, there is value in the pause. Because it prevents you from moving automatically. It keeps you connected to your own experience. And from that connection, your responses become more intentional. You may still choose to say yes. But now, it comes with awareness. With a sense of what you are giving, and why. And that awareness changes how the experience feels. There is less resistance. Less internal tension. Because your action and your intention are aligned. At the same time, you may begin to say no more often. Not as a rejection, but as a recognition. A recognition of your limits. Your priorities. Your current state. And this recognition is not selfish. It is necessary. Because without it, your energy becomes scattered. Pulled in different directions, without a clear center. And over time, that scattering leads to fatigue. Not just physical, but emotional and mental. A sense of being constantly engaged, but not fully present. And protecting your energy is not about withdrawing from life. It is about engaging with it more intentionally. Choosing where you place your attention. Where you invest your time. Where you direct your presence. And this choice does not isolate you. It grounds you. It allows you to show up more fully in the places that matter. Because your energy is not being diluted. It is being focused. And that focus creates depth. In your work. In your relationships. In your own experience of yourself. You are no longer spread thin across many moments. You are present within the ones you choose. And that presence changes the quality of everything. But this shift also requires something else. A willingness to let some things remain undone. Unanswered. Unaccepted. Not because they are unimportant, but because they are not aligned. And this can feel uncomfortable. Because it goes against the habit of filling every space, responding to every request, being available at all times. But as you continue to trust your awareness, that discomfort begins to soften. You begin to see that not everything needs your attention. That your value is not measured by how much you can give, but by how aligned your giving is. And this realization brings a different kind of clarity. You are not here to respond to everything. You are here to choose. And in that choosing, your time and energy begin to reflect something deeper. Not just your availability, but your intention. And as that intention becomes clearer, something else begins to emerge. A sense of direction. Not imposed from the outside, but shaped from within. Because the way you use your energy gradually shapes the path you are walking. Moment by moment. Choice by choice. And as you become more aware of that, the question begins to shift once again. Not just how you protect your energy, but what you are choosing to give it to, and why. Chapter 10, The Quiet Confidence of No. A moment arrives, familiar in shape, but different in how it feels. Someone asks for your time, your help, your presence, and as the request settles, you pause. Not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. You feel the space inside you, the quiet clarity that has been growing through all these small shifts. And when you respond, the word comes simply. No. There is no rush to explain it away. No immediate urge to soften it or reshape it. Just a calm expression is steady, unforced, complete. And what follows is not tension, not the familiar wave of doubt, but something quieter. A sense of stillness. This is where something important begins to take form. Because confidence, in this context, does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with certainty or control. It appears quietly, in the absence of inner conflict. In the space where your response and your experience are no longer in opposition. For a long time, confidence may have felt like something external. Something tied to how well you manage situations, how smoothly you navigate interactions, how positively others respond. But what you are beginning to experience now is different. It is not dependent on outcomes. It is not shaped by approval. It is rooted in alignment. A quiet knowing that what you are expressing reflects what you feel. And that knowing creates a different kind of stability. You are no longer trying to hold everything together. You are simply standing within yourself. Have you ever noticed how different a moment feels when you are not second-guessing your response? When you are not replaying what you said, adjusting it in your mind, wondering how it was received. There is a lightness to it. Not because the situation is easier, but because you are no longer divided within it. Your attention is not split between what you said and what you wish you had said. It remains present. And that presence is what gives your response its strength. Not force. Not intensity. Just clarity. And this clarity does not come from eliminating uncertainty. It comes from accepting that your response does not need to be perfect, it only needs to be honest. Because when you try to perfect your response, you move away from yourself. You begin to shape your words around outcomes, around reactions, around expectations. But when you allow your response to be simple, grounded, true to your current experience, it carries a different quality. It feels complete. And that completeness is what allows you to move forward without lingering doubt. But this shift is not about becoming rigid. It is not about saying no more often just to prove something. It is about the way your no is expressed. The energy behind it. Because a no that comes from resistance feels different from a no that comes from clarity. One is tense, guarded, reactive. The other is calm, steady, open. And people can sense that difference. Even if they don't consciously recognize it. When your response is grounded, it does not create as much friction. Because it is not pushing against anything. It is simply stating what is. And this simplicity is powerful. Because it removes the need to defend yourself. You are not arguing for your position. You are not trying to convince. You are simply expressing. And in that expression, there is a quiet confidence. Not because you are certain about everything, but because you are connected to yourself. And that connection allows you to remain steady, even when the moment around you is uncertain. Have you ever stayed present after saying no, without immediately trying to fill the space? just allowing the moment to exist without rushing to smooth it over? There is a kind of strength in that. Not visible on the surface, but deeply felt. Because you are no longer trying to control the reaction. You are allowing it. And in doing so, you remain grounded. You don't move away from yourself to manage the moment. You stay. And that staying changes your relationship with discomfort. It becomes something you can experience without needing to escape it. And over time, this builds a different kind of resilience. Not the kind that pushes through difficulty, but the kind that remains present within it. And from that presence, your responses become more consistent. More reliable. Not in what you say, but in how you feel when you say it. You begin to trust that your clarity will guide you. That you don't need to anticipate every outcome. That you don't need to prepare for every possible reaction. Because your response is not about controlling the situation. It is about expressing what is true for you in this moment. And that truth, even when it is simple, carries weight. Not because it is forceful, but because it is grounded. And as you continue to experience this, your relationship with yourself begins to deepen. You start to rely less on external signals. Less on validation, reassurance, approval. And more on your own internal sense of alignment. And this shift is subtle, but profound. Because it changes where your stability comes from. You are no longer anchored in how things appear. You are anchored in how things feel within you. And from that place, your decisions become clearer. Less influenced by pressure. Less shaped by expectation. More connected to your own experience. And this connection creates a kind of quiet trust. A sense that you can move through situations without losing yourself. That you can engage, respond, decide, while remaining grounded. And this trust is what allows your no to feel natural. Not something you build up to. Not something you rehearse. Just something that emerges when it needs to. And when it does, it carries a certain ease. Even if the moment is uncertain. Even if the response is not what others expected. Because your focus is no longer on managing the moment. It is on remaining aligned within it. And that alignment, over time, becomes your reference point. Not perfection. Not approval. Alignment. And as this becomes more familiar, something else begins to shift. The way you relate to silence. To space. To the moments after your response. You no longer feel the need to fill them. To explain more, to adjust, to soften unnecessarily. You allow your words to stand. And in doing so, you begin to see that your response is enough. Not because it satisfies every expectation, but because it reflects your truth. And that realization removes a layer of pressure. You are not responsible for making every moment comfortable. You are responsible for being present and honest. And that is enough. And as you continue to move from this place, your sense of self becomes more stable. Less reactive. Less dependent. More grounded. Because it is no longer shaped primarily by external interaction. It is shaped by your relationship with your own experience. And that relationship becomes the foundation of your confidence. Quiet. Unassuming. But steady. And from this steadiness, your life begins to feel different. Not because everything changes externally, but because you are no longer moving through it in the same way. You are not adapting constantly. You are choosing. You are not reacting automatically. You are responding. And that shift continues to deepen. Because once you experience this kind of clarity, this kind of alignment, the question is no longer about whether you can say no. It becomes something more expansive. How this quiet confidence begins to influence everything else you allow into your life. A life that belongs to you. Somewhere along the way, something softened. Not in a way that made you weaker, but in a way that made you more honest with yourself. The urgency to respond quickly has quieted. The need to adjust constantly has loosened its grip. And in its place, there is a different kind of presence, one that feels less reactive, more aware, less scattered, more grounded. You may not notice it all at once. It appears in small moments. In the way you pause before answering. In the way you sense what feels right, even before you explain it. In the way your responses begin to carry less tension and more clarity. And as these moments accumulate, something becomes clear. You are no longer moving through your life in the same way. There was a time when your attention was often outside of you, focused on what was expected, what was needed, what would keep things smooth. And in that movement, parts of your own experience were set aside, not intentionally, but quietly, consistently. Now, there is a shift. Your attention includes you. Not in a way that separates you from others, but in a way that brings you fully into the moment. You are no longer just responding to life, you are participating in it. And this participation feels different. More steady. More real. Because it is no longer shaped only by what is happening around you, but also by what is happening within you. What you feel. What you sense. What aligns. These are no longer things you move past. They are things you include. And that inclusion changes everything. Not dramatically, but deeply. The space you've created through your no, it begins to take on a quiet significance. It is no longer just the absence of something. It is the presence of choice. The presence of awareness. The presence of you. And within that space, your life begins to unfold differently. Not because you are forcing it to change, but because you are no longer filling it automatically. You are allowing it to be shaped, moment by moment, through what you choose to give your energy to. And that shaping feels more intentional. More connected. Less like something you are keeping up with, more like something you are living. There may still be moments where old patterns appear. Where you move quickly, where you say yes without fully checking in, where you feel that familiar pull to adjust. And when that happens, you notice. Not with judgment, but with awareness. Because now, you can see the difference. You can feel when something is aligned, and when it is not. And that ability, that quiet recognition, becomes your guide. You don't need to force yourself into a new way of being. You simply return to what you already know. To that pause. To that awareness. To that sense of what feels true. And from there, your responses continue to evolve. Gently. Naturally. Without pressure. What once felt difficult begins to feel more familiar. What once felt uncomfortable begins to feel more neutral. And what once felt like something you had to learn begins to feel like something you already are. Not a different person. Just a more present version of yourself. And in that presence, something settles. A quiet confidence, not based on certainty, but on connection. You are connected to what you feel, to what you need, to what matters. And that connection remains, even as everything around you continues to change. Because it is not dependent on circumstances. It is something you carry. Something you return to. Again and again. And from that place, your life no longer feels like something you have to manage constantly. It feels like something you are in relationship with. Responsive, but not reactive. Open, but not ungrounded. And within that relationship, there is a sense of trust. Not that everything will be easy, but that you will meet each moment with awareness. With presence. With choice. And that is enough. Because a life that belongs to you is not defined by perfection. It is defined by alignment. By the quiet way your inner experience and your outer actions begin to move together, without force. Without conflict. Just naturally. And as you continue forward, that is what remains. Not a rule. Not a method. But a simple, steady knowing. You can pause. You can feel. You can choose.